My name is Emma. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, people would probably describe me with words like supportive, reliable, or quiet. The kind of woman who remembers birthdays, keeps the bills paid, and makes sure the lights stay on even when everyone else is too busy chasing bigger dreams to notice. To be honest, I've never been the loudest person in a room. I don't interrupt people. I listen more than I speak. And because of that, many people assume they understand me very quickly. They usually think I'm the kind of person who simply stays where she's placed. For 12 years of my marriage, that assumption seemed true. My husband Daniel had a dream, a big one, the kind of dream people admire because it sounds brave and ambitious. He wanted to build his own company, to create something meaningful, something successful, something that would prove to the world, and maybe to himself, that he was capable of more than the ordinary path. And I believed in him. Not casually, not from a distance. I believed in him in the way that changes the direction of your own life. I worked overtime so he could take risks. I agreed to move cities twice so he could chase opportunities. I quietly set aside goals I once had for myself because supporting his vision seemed like the right thing to do. For years, I told myself that this was what partnership looked like. You carry the weight together. You take turns holding the future. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It happened in small moments, comments that lingered longer than they should have, assumptions that slowly became expectations, and a role I never consciously agreed to but somehow ended up playing. The moment that changed everything wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene, just a single sentence spoken across our kitchen table one evening. Daniel looked at me and said, almost casually, "Maybe the reason I haven't succeeded yet is because you've been holding me back." For a long time after that, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. But that was the day I began seeing our marriage very differently. And the strange thing about quiet realizations is that they don't look dramatic from the outside. But inside, they change everything. So this story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliation or anger. It's about what happens when someone you've quietly supported for years finally reveals how little they truly understood about you. And what happens next when you decide, without announcing it, to stop playing the role they assigned you. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever realized that someone had misunderstood your strength for weakness, for far longer than you realized? For most of my marriage, the way people saw me was surprisingly simple. I was Daniel's wife, not Emma, not the woman with opinions, plans, or her own quiet ambitions, just the person standing slightly behind him in photographs. If you asked Daniel's friends about me back then, they would probably have said kind things. Nothing cruel, nothing insulting, but their descriptions always sounded similar. Emma's really supportive. She's so patient with Daniel's schedule. Honestly, he's lucky she handles all the practical stuff. Practical stuff. That phrase followed me for years. It meant the bills, the grocery lists, the landlord emails, the insurance forms, the long drives between cities when Daniel's startup meetings ran late. It meant researching apartments when we relocated to Portland for his first big opportunity. It meant staying up at night recalculating our finances when his second project collapsed. And we suddenly had 6 months of uncertainty ahead of us. But when people described those things, they never said them with a tone of something important. They said it the way people describe background music. Necessary, but invisible. Daniel didn't start out dismissive. That part is important. When we first met, he was warm, ambitious, and endlessly curious about the future. We were both 24, both working entry-level jobs, both convinced life was about to open doors we hadn't even imagined yet. Back then, when he talked about building something of his own, his voice would light up in a way that made you want to believe with him. And I did. I remember the first time he said it out loud. We were sitting on the floor of our tiny one-bedroom apartment, surrounded by pizza boxes and a whiteboard he'd bought for brainstorming ideas. "I think I could actually do this," he said, pacing around the room. "Like, build something real." I was the one who handed him the marker. "Then start writing," I told him. And for a long time, that's exactly how things felt. Like we were building something together. But slowly, so slowly I didn't notice it happening, our roles began to shift. Daniel became the dreamer. I became the structure around the dream. When his work hours stretched later into the night, I adjusted my schedule. When he needed to travel for investor meetings, I picked up extra freelance work to stabilize our income. When friends asked how things were going, Daniel talked about growth, expansion, and new opportunities. And I would smile and say things like, "We're figuring it out." It became such a natural habit that I rarely thought about how little space there was in those conversations for my own life. Not because Daniel told me there wasn't space, but because everyone, including me, seemed to assume that my role was already defined. Reliable, supportive, practical, invisible. There's something strange about being quietly competent for a long time. People begin to treat stability like it simply exists on its own. They don't ask who is maintaining it. They don't ask what it costs. Even Daniel stopped asking those questions eventually. If something in our life worked smoothly, he assumed it would continue working. Because it always had. Because I always made sure it did. Looking back now, I don't think anyone in our circle truly saw the pattern forming. Not Daniel, not our friends, and definitely not me. At least, not yet. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves eventually. Usually, in moments that seem small at first. Moments that pass quickly enough for everyone else to forget them. Except for the person who felt the shift the moment it happened. And the first time that happened to me was during a dinner that almost no one else remembers. The dinner itself wasn't anything special. Just 4 of us at a small Italian restaurant in Portland. Daniel, me, and another couple we'd known since the early startup days. Marcus had once worked with Daniel on a short-lived project, and his wife, Leah, had quickly become someone I genuinely liked. She had a straightforward warmth about her, the kind that made conversations feel easy. At the time, Daniel's newest business idea was gaining attention. Not success yet, but attention. He'd been meeting with investors, attending networking events, and talking constantly about potential growth. That night, the restaurant buzzed with the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses. A small candle flickered between us on the table. Marcus was asking Daniel about the company's progress. "So," Marcus said, leaning forward, "how's the big venture going?" Daniel smiled the way he always did when someone asked about his work. Part confidence, part performance. "It's moving," he said. "Slowly, but it's moving. There's real potential." Marcus nodded. "That's huge, man. Seriously. Starting something from nothing takes guts." Daniel glanced briefly in my direction. Then he laughed lightly and said something that, at the time, sounded almost like a joke. "Well," he said, gesturing toward me with his fork, "Emma makes sure I stay grounded. Someone has to handle the boring parts of life." Everyone chuckled. Leah smiled politely. Marcus raised his glass and said, "Every visionary needs someone keeping the lights on." The conversation kept moving. They started talking about funding rounds, market trends, and a new tech conference happening in San Francisco. No one meant anything by it. That was the strange part. There was no cruelty in the moment. Just an assumption quietly reinforced. But something about Daniel's tone lingered with me. Not the words themselves. The ease with which he said them. The way he summarized my role was so casual. The boring parts of life. I remember taking a sip of water and smiling along with everyone else. Because what else was I supposed to do? Correct him? interrupt the flow of a perfectly pleasant evening to explain that those boring parts included managing our finances, coordinating Daniel's travel, negotiating lease agreements when we moved, and quietly stabilizing the unpredictable financial swings of a startup life. That would have sounded defensive, dramatic, so I let it go. Most people would have. But on the drive home that night, the silence between Daniel and me felt slightly different. Not tense, just thoughtful. Streetlights slid across the windshield as we moved through the city. Daniel tapped his fingers lightly against the steering wheel, still energized from the conversation. "You know, Marcus always exaggerates things," he said suddenly. "Calling me a visionary like that." I nodded. "You're ambitious," I said. "That's not the same thing as exaggeration." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that suggested agreement. Then he added, almost absent-mindedly, "Honestly, I couldn't do half this stuff if you weren't so good at handling the everyday things." It sounded like appreciation. Maybe it was meant that way. But something inside me noticed a detail I hadn't paid attention to before. He didn't say we built this life together. He said he couldn't do his work without someone managing the rest. And somehow, without discussing it, that role had quietly become mine. I looked out the window at the passing city lights, and for the first time, a small thought crossed my mind. Not loud, not angry, just curious. When did my entire identity become the infrastructure for someone else's ambition? It wasn't a painful realization yet, just a small one. But sometimes the smallest realizations are the ones that stay with you the longest. Because once you notice them, you start seeing them everywhere. After that dinner, nothing dramatic changed. That's usually how these things happen. There's no sudden shift in the relationship, no moment where you think, this is the beginning of something bad. Life simply continues in the same direction it always has. Daniel kept working on his company. I kept holding everything else together. But once a thought enters your mind, it quietly changes the way you observe the world around you. And I started noticing things. Not big things, small ones. The kind that are easy to dismiss if you want to. Like the way Daniel would answer questions about our life when people asked how we managed the stress of startup uncertainty. "Emma's great with logistics," he'd say. Logistics. It was another word that sounded neutral, even complimentary. But it also reduced years of emotional and financial support into something that sounded like managing a calendar, or the way conversations with friends started unfolding. At gatherings, Daniel would stand in a small circle explaining his latest idea or business pivot. People listened, asked questions, and nodded thoughtfully. I usually stood beside him, smiling quietly. Sometimes someone would turn to me and say something like, "You must be really proud of him." "Ta naman," and I would nod. Because the truth was, I was proud, not of the company itself necessarily. It was still unstable and uncertain, but of the effort he put into it. The long hours, the risk, the determination. But pride is a complicated emotion when it exists alongside invisibility. Because no one ever asked me questions about my own work, or my plans, or whether I wanted something more than just stability. It became a quiet pattern. Daniel's dreams were the main storyline. My role was the supporting infrastructure. And the strange part is that I helped reinforce that pattern myself. When people praised Daniel, I added details that made him sound even more impressive. When he talked about future goals, I encouraged him. When financial stress appeared, as it often did, I reassured him that we would figure it out. Because that's what partners do, right? They support each other. At least, that's what I believed. But support only works when it moves in both directions. And slowly, without anyone explicitly saying it out loud, our relationship stopped working that way. I noticed it in the language Daniel used when he talked about the future, my company, my vision, my opportunity. Rarely anything. even when the reality behind the scenes was far more complicated. There was one moment that stayed with me more clearly than the others. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing notes from a meeting with potential investors. Papers were scattered everywhere, along with his laptop and 3 empty coffee mugs. I had just finished reorganizing our monthly budget, again, because one of his projects had taken longer to generate income than expected. I placed a printed spreadsheet beside him. "We should probably slow down on travel expenses for a while," I said gently. "Just until the next contract closes." Daniel glanced at the paper. "Barely." Then he waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Those details always work themselves out." I remember standing there for a second, looking at the spreadsheet, because those details didn't work themselves out. They worked out because I spent hours making sure they did. But I didn't say that. Instead, I just nodded and said, "Okay." And that was the moment I began doing something I hadn't done before. I started keeping track. Not in a confrontational way, not to prove a point, just noticing the comments, the assumptions. The way I work behind the scenes slowly became something people treated as automatic, reliable, invisible. And the more I noticed it, the more I began to realize something unsettling. This wasn't just about how Daniel saw me. It was about the role everyone had quietly agreed I would play, including me. Once you begin noticing a pattern, it becomes difficult to stop. Not because the behavior changes, but because your awareness does. Before, I had moved through our life almost automatically, doing the things that needed to be done simply because they needed doing. Now I began to see the shape of the role I had gradually stepped into. Reliable, capable, always available, but rarely acknowledged. It showed up in small ways first. When Daniel scheduled meetings, he assumed I would adjust my own plans if something in our household needed attention. When friends visited from out of town, I was the one coordinating dinners, reservations, and spare bedrooms. Even when something went wrong, an overdue bill, a scheduling conflict, a travel delay, the first instinct everyone had was to look toward me, not to blame, but for solutions. At some point, without anyone formally deciding it, I had become the stabilizing force of our entire life. The strange thing about being that person is that people begin to trust you completely, but they also begin to rely on you so thoroughly that they forget you're choosing to carry the responsibility. It starts to look like your natural state, like gravity, something that simply exists. One evening, Daniel's parents came to visit. They lived a few hours away, and we only saw them a handful of times each year. His mother, Susan, was kind but direct in the way many parents are when they feel comfortable speaking their minds. We were sitting around the dining table after dinner. Daniel was describing his latest business development, something about expanding into a new market, potential partnerships, and future growth. His father nodded thoughtfully. "That's a big step," he said. "Takes courage." Then Susan turned toward me with a warm smile. "And Emma," she said, "you've always been so good at keeping everything steady while Daniel focuses on the bigger picture." She meant it as a compliment. I could tell by the softness in her voice. But the words hung in the air longer than she probably intended. Keeping everything steady. Daniel didn't react. He simply kept talking about the company. And I smiled politely. Because again, correcting that moment would have felt unnecessary, maybe even rude. But something about that phrase stayed with me. Later that night, after his parents left, I was washing the dishes while Daniel scrolled through emails at the kitchen counter. Water ran over the plates as I replayed the conversation in my head. Finally, I asked something simple. "Do you think that's how people see me?" Daniel looked up. "Who sees you?" "Your family, your friends." He shrugged lightly. "I mean, you are the stable one," he said. "That's a good thing." He said it casually, without thinking about the weight behind the words. Stable, not ambitious, not independent, Not driven, just stable. I dried my hands on a towel and leaned against the counter. What if I wanted to focus on something bigger, too? I asked. Daniel paused for a moment, as if the idea hadn't fully occurred to him before. Then he smiled, not dismissively, but reassuringly. You could, he said, but honestly, things work really well the way they are. The way they are. That sentence wasn't meant to limit me, but it quietly revealed something important. Daniel didn't see my role as temporary. He saw it as permanent, necessary, almost structural, like the foundation of a house. Strong, dependable, but never meant to move. And that was the first time I began to wonder about something I had never seriously considered before. What would happen if one day the foundation decided it no longer wanted to carry the entire structure? If you had walked into our apartment that evening, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. The kitchen lights were warm. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Typical Seattle weather. Daniel sat across from me at the table with his laptop open, scrolling through emails between bites of dinner. It looked like an ordinary night. And in many ways, it was. But sometimes the moments that quietly change your life arrive disguised as routine. That evening started with a conversation about work. Daniel had just returned from a meeting with a potential investor. I could see the tension in his shoulders the moment he walked through the door. He dropped his bag near the couch and sighed. Another delay, he said. I set 2 plates on the table. What happened? They want more traction before committing, he replied, rubbing his forehead. More growth, more proof. I nodded slowly. That had been the pattern for months. Promising conversations followed by cautious hesitation. After a few minutes of silence, Daniel began talking again. But this time, the frustration in his voice was sharper. I just don't get it, he said. Everything should be moving faster by now. I listened quietly, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned over the years that when Daniel felt cornered by disappointment, advice usually sounded like criticism. So I let him talk. He listed obstacles, market conditions, timing, investor expectations. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. And that's when he said it. Not angrily, not even intentionally cruel, just casually, like a passing thought that had been sitting in the back of his mind for a while. You know, he said slowly, sometimes I wonder if part of the reason things haven't taken off yet is that you've been holding me back. The words landed so quietly that for a second, I wasn't even sure I had heard them correctly. I looked up from my plate. What do you mean? I asked. Daniel shrugged. I don't know, he said. Maybe if things were different, if there wasn't always so much stability here. Stability. The same word again. I mean, he continued, maybe I'd push harder if I didn't feel like there was always a safety net. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Rain tapped against the window. The refrigerator hummed softly behind us. Daniel took another bite of food, as if he had simply made an observation. And that's when something inside me shifted. Not dramatically. There was no sudden anger, no raised voices, just a quiet realization settling into place. For 12 years, I had believed that my support helped Daniel move forward, but in his mind, it had become an obstacle, a limitation, a reason he could point to when things didn't work out. I studied his face for a moment. He didn't look malicious. If anything, he looked thoughtful, like someone trying to solve a problem. But the problem he was trying to solve had suddenly become me. I set my fork down gently. I see, I said. Daniel glanced up briefly. You know I don't mean it in a bad way, he added quickly. It's just something I've been thinking about. I nodded again. And strangely, in that moment, I felt calmer than I had in months, because something that had always been vague suddenly became very clear. Daniel didn't see me as a partner in his journey anymore. He saw me as part of the environment. Something constant. Something predictable. Something that would always remain exactly where it was. He believed my presence was fixed, permanent, unchangeable. And for the first time in years, I realized something important. He had absolutely no idea who I might become, if that assumption stopped being true. So I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind him of the sacrifices or the late nights or the spreadsheets balancing our entire life. Instead, I simply finished my dinner and quietly began looking at our marriage through a completely different lens. After that night, Daniel expected a reaction. I could see it in the way he watched me over the next few days. Not constantly, just occasionally. A glance across the room, a pause in conversation, the subtle curiosity people have when they think they might have said something controversial. But the reaction never came. I didn't argue with him. I didn't bring the conversation up again. And eventually, Daniel seemed to assume that the comment had simply passed, that I had interpreted it the same way he did, as a moment of frustration, nothing more. Which, in a way, was true. It was a moment of frustration, just not the kind he imagined. What Daniel didn't realize was that my silence had changed. Before that night, my silence came from patience, from understanding, from a belief that the pressures he carried justified occasional thoughtless words. After that night, my silence became something else entirely. It became intentional, observant, almost strategic. I didn't confront him because confrontation would have led to explanations. Apologies, maybe. Promises that things would be different. But explanations wouldn't change the deeper reality I had just seen clearly for the first time. Daniel believed something about me that wasn't true. He believed I was incapable of stepping outside the role I had been playing. And sometimes the most revealing thing you can do is allow someone to keep believing their assumptions. So I watched. Not suspiciously. Just carefully. And once I started paying attention, I noticed how deeply that assumption had shaped our entire life. Daniel began making plans without really consulting me. Not because he intended to exclude me, but because he assumed I would adapt. If he scheduled a late-night meeting, I handled dinner. If he planned a last-minute trip for a conference, I rearranged our calendar. If financial uncertainty appeared, I quietly stabilized the situation. It had become an invisible system, one that ran smoothly because I maintained it. But now I have begun doing something different. I still fulfilled my responsibilities, but I stopped filling the spaces he hadn't noticed. If Daniel forgot to confirm a reservation, I didn't step in immediately. If he overlooked a scheduling conflict, I waited to see whether he would notice. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. And each small observation told me something important. The more I stepped back, the more visible the structure of our life became. Like stepping away from a painting and finally seeing the whole composition. Daniel had grown used to a certain kind of stability, the kind that exists quietly in the background. But stability isn't automatic. It's built, maintained, protected. And for 12 years, I had been the one doing that work. The strange part was that I didn't feel angry. If anything, I felt curious. Because once the emotional fog of disappointment faded, a different realization began to form. Daniel's comment had revealed more than just his frustration. It had revealed his misunderstanding. He believed my presence limited his ambition, but he had never asked what my ambition actually looked like. And for the first time in a long while, I started asking myself that question too. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. Late at night, while Daniel worked in the living room. Early in the morning, while drinking coffee before the day began. I opened the worn leather notebook I'd carried for years, the one where I tracked expenses, plans, and small observations about our life. For a long time, it had only contained numbers and schedules. But slowly, New pages began filling with different kinds of notes, questions, possibilities, things I had once set aside without realizing it. And as those pages grew, one realization became clearer than any other. Daniel believed my silence meant nothing was changing. But sometimes, silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's preparation. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Most of the time, it just looks like someone quietly going about their normal life, which is exactly what Daniel saw when he looked at me during those months. Emma is making coffee in the morning. Emma is answering emails from her administrative job. Emma is organizing bills, schedules, groceries, and travel plans. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, nothing that suggested anything in our life was shifting beneath the surface. But inside my notebook, the pages were starting to look very different. At first, the changes were small. I began reviewing our finances more carefully than I ever had before. Not just the monthly balance, but the long-term structure of our accounts. Savings, investments, debt, ownership. For years, I had managed most of these details simply to keep things running smoothly. But now I started asking different questions. Questions about independence. Questions about options. Daniel never noticed. To him, financial spreadsheets were just another part of the boring life details he trusted me to handle. But the deeper I looked, the clearer something became. For 12 years, while Daniel focused on growth and opportunity, I had quietly built a system of stability around us. Emergency funds, separate savings, well-documented expenses, carefully tracked contracts. Nothing secretive, just organized. The kind of organization that becomes extremely valuable when circumstances change. Around the same time, I started doing something else Daniel didn't notice. Learning. At night, after he fell asleep or became absorbed in work, I opened my laptop and started reading. Articles about personal finance, courses on business operations, legal basics about partnerships, contracts, and asset ownership. Not obsessively, just steadily. The more I read, the more I realized how much practical knowledge I had already accumulated simply by managing the operational side of Daniel's career. Every lease negotiation, every budget adjustment, every invoice, every contract review. For years, I had treated those tasks as supportive work, but now I started seeing them differently. They were skills, real ones, transferable, valuable. And the strange thing about recognizing your own capabilities after years of overlooking them is that it changes the way you move through the world. You become quieter, more focused, less reactive. Daniel occasionally commented on it. One evening, he looked up from his laptop and said, "You've been really calm lately." I smiled. "Have I?" "Yeah," he said. "I guess things just feel stable right now." Stable. There was that word again. But this time when I heard it, I didn't feel diminished. I felt something closer to clarity. Because stability had never been the absence of ambition. It had been the foundation that allowed ambition to exist safely. Daniel had simply mistaken the foundation for the entire structure. And while he continued focusing on the visible parts of his company, the investors, the strategy meetings, the market projections, I quietly began focusing on something else entirely. Documentation. Over the years, I had kept records of nearly everything related to our lives. Not out of suspicion, just habit. Expense reports, contracts, loan agreements. Daniel occasionally paid business expenses through our shared accounts, all carefully organized in digital folders. Now I reviewed them again. Slowly, carefully, not looking for mistakes, just understanding the full picture. And the more I studied those records, the more one quiet realization emerged. Daniel believed his company was the central engine of our lives. But financially, structurally, and legally, the situation was more complicated than he understood. Not because anyone had deceived him, but because he had never taken the time to look closely at the details. Those details had always been my responsibility, my domain, my boring logistics. And for the first time, I began to see how much leverage quiet responsibility can create over time. Not power in a dramatic sense, just clarity. The kind of clarity that changes the way you think about the future. I didn't celebrate that realization. I didn't even tell anyone about it. I simply wrote one sentence in my notebook that night. A sentence that felt less like a plan and more like an observation. I have more options than anyone realizes. And once that truth settled into place, something inside me became very calm. Because preparation isn't about revenge. It's about understanding your position clearly enough to make a decision when the moment arrives. And slowly, that moment was getting closer. The moment of clarity didn't arrive with drama. It came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a set of documents I had opened dozens of times before. But this time, I wasn't looking at them as Daniel's supportive partner. I was looking at them as someone trying to understand the full structure of our life. The files were related to Daniel's company. Over the years, I had occasionally helped him organize paperwork, contracts with early collaborators, expense reports, draft agreements with investors who had shown interest but never finalized funding. Daniel never liked administrative work. He trusted me to clean things up when needed. So the files ended up on my computer. Not hidden, just stored. I opened one of the earliest agreements from when Daniel first began building the company. It was informal at the time, more of a partnership outline than a finalized legal structure. Daniel and one of his early collaborators had drafted it themselves before involving a lawyer months later. I remembered helping him proofread it years ago. Back then, I had skimmed through the language simply to catch typos. But now, reading it with a different mindset, certain details stood out immediately. Equity structure, financial responsibility, ownership distribution. The document was written during a period when Daniel had very little personal capital. To get the company moving, he had used funds from our shared savings. Savings I had built carefully over several years of consistent work. At the time, we both saw that money as belonging to the household, as belonging to us. The agreement reflected that reality in ways Daniel had probably forgotten. My name appeared in the documentation, not as a formal partner in daily operations, but as a financial contributor tied to early funding. It wasn't a controlling position, but it was significant enough that certain decisions required acknowledgement of the initial investment. I leaned back in my chair and reread the sections slowly. Not with excitement, with curiosity. Because Daniel had spent the past few years talking about his company as if it existed entirely within his personal control. His vision, his leadership, his risk. But the structure underneath told a more nuanced story. One that included quiet contributions he had stopped noticing. I opened additional files, later agreements, revised contracts. Some of them clarified ownership percentages. Others documented loans Daniel had taken from our shared funds during periods when the business needed support. Each document painted a clearer picture. Nothing illegal, nothing manipulative, just reality recorded on paper. The kind of reality people overlook when they assume the details are someone else's responsibility. I closed the final document and sat there for a moment. Outside my office window, the city moved through its normal afternoon rhythm. Cars passed. People walked along the sidewalk with coffee cups and backpacks. Everything looked ordinary, and strangely, that made the moment feel even calmer. Because the discovery didn't create power. It created understanding. Daniel believed I was the obstacle holding him back, but the legal and financial structure of his own company quietly acknowledged something different. That for years, I had been part of the foundation he built on. Not visibly, not publicly, but undeniably. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was something simpler. Clarity. For the first time, I could see the full shape of our situation, not just emotionally, but structurally. And clarity has a quiet effect on the mind. It removes confusion. It removes doubt. It replaces speculation with options. I opened my notebook and wrote a few lines summarizing what I had confirmed. Then I closed the laptop. There was nothing urgent to do. No confrontation required. No immediate decision. Just information. The kind of information that changes how you think about the future. That evening, Daniel came home excited about a potential partnership discussion he had scheduled for the following week. He talked for nearly 20 minutes about growth projections and market positioning. I listened the same way I always had. Patiently, attentively. But this time, when he described the company as if it existed entirely within his control, I didn't feel the quiet frustration I might have felt months earlier. Instead, I simply noticed something. Daniel still believed the story he had built about our life. The story where he was the visionary and I was the stability. But now I understand something he didn't. Stories are powerful. Until someone quietly changes the ending. Clarity has an interesting effect on the way you think. Once you truly understand your position, the emotional noise fades. You stop reacting to every comment, every assumption, every small moment of disrespect. Instead, you begin asking one quiet question. What do I actually want now? For years, that question hadn't really existed in my life. Not because I lacked ambition, but because my energy had been directed somewhere else. Toward stability, toward partnership, toward helping Daniel build something he believed in. But now the situation looked different. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just clearly. And clarity forces choices. For several weeks, I carried that question with me everywhere. Not in a heavy way, more like a quiet companion in the background of my thoughts. When I woke up in the morning, when I walked to work, when I sat across from Daniel at the dinner table, listening to him talk about the future. What do I actually want now? There were several possible answers. One option was confrontation. I could sit Daniel down and explain everything I had realized. About the financial structure of the company, about the role I had played in building the stability he relied on. Maybe he would understand. Maybe he would apologize. Maybe we would renegotiate the shape of our relationship. Another option was a compromise. I could begin asserting my own ambitions more openly while staying within the framework of our marriage. Shift the balance slowly. Rebuild the partnership. In many ways, that might have been the most reasonable path. But every time I imagined those conversations, something inside me hesitated. Not out of fear, out of recognition. Daniel's comment at the kitchen table had revealed something deeper than frustration. It revealed how he truly saw our roles. Not temporarily, fundamentally. In his mind, my presence had become the explanation for his limitations. And once someone begins believing that narrative, changing it rarely happens quickly. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all. So I considered the third option. The one that required the least explanation, the least negotiation, the least emotional effort. Quiet separation. Not dramatic, not hostile, just decisive. I didn't rush that thought. Decisions that reshape your life deserve patience. So I gave myself time. Weeks passed. I continued observing, listening. And what I noticed during that time only reinforced the clarity I already felt. Daniel never revisited the conversation about me holding him back. Not once. Not to clarify it, not to apologize, not even to check whether the comment had hurt me. To him, it had simply been a passing thought. But the absence of reflection revealed something important. He didn't realize how significant that moment had been. And that meant any future change in our relationship would probably require me to carry the emotional labor of explaining everything. Again. Just as I had quietly carried so many other things for years. One evening, I sat alone in the living room after Daniel went to bed. My notebook rested on the coffee table beside me. I opened to a blank page. At the top, I wrote 3 simple words. What comes next? Then I began listing the steps required for each possible future. Conversation. Compromise. Separation. I studied the pages for a long time, not searching for the easiest path, just the most honest one. And sometime around midnight, the answer settled into place with surprising calm. Not with sadness, not with anger, just certainty. Because once you truly see the structure of a relationship, you also see whether it can realistically change. I closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and quietly accepted the decision that would make everything else irreversible. Once the decision was made, something unexpected happened. Life became quieter. Not externally. From the outside, nothing about our routine looked different. Daniel still left early for meetings. I still went to work, managed the household, answered emails, and paid bills. But internally, the uncertainty had disappeared. And when uncertainty disappears, action becomes very simple. I didn't rush. The point wasn't speed. The point was precision. The first step was understanding exactly where I stood legally and financially, not through assumptions, but through professional advice. So, one Thursday afternoon, during a lunch break, Daniel assumed I was spending at a cafe near my office. I walked into a small law office a few blocks away instead. The meeting was quiet and practical. No dramatic confessions, no emotional speeches. I simply explained the situation in clear terms. The marriage, the financial contributions to Daniel's business, the shared accounts, and the documented investments. The lawyer listened carefully while reviewing the copies of agreements I had brought. Occasionally, he nodded. Occasionally, he asked clarifying questions. When he finished reading, he looked up at me with a thoughtful expression. "You've kept very thorough records," he said. I smiled faintly. That's been part of my job for a long time. He tapped one of the documents lightly with his pen. "Based on these agreements," he continued, "you have more financial leverage than most people in similar situations." Leverage. It was a technical word. Neutral. But hearing it spoken aloud confirmed what I had already begun to understand on my own. Not power, just position. The rest of the meeting focused on logistics, separate accounts, asset documentation, possible timelines. Nothing confrontational, just preparation. Over the next few weeks, I quietly completed the steps we discussed. A personal savings account was opened. Some shared financial responsibilities were reorganized in ways that would make future transitions cleaner. Important documents were copied and securely stored. All simple actions. All completely legal. All invisible to someone who wasn't looking closely. Daniel didn't notice. Not because he didn't care, but because he trusted the system of stability that had always surrounded him. He assumed it would continue operating exactly as it always had, which meant my quiet adjustments blended seamlessly into the routine of daily life. One evening, he even commented on how organized everything felt lately. "I swear you keep our entire life running," he said with a laugh while reviewing an expense summary I had prepared. I smiled. "That's the idea." He meant it as appreciation. And maybe it was. But the meaning behind the words had changed for me. Because the system I had maintained for years was no longer being maintained for the same reason. Before, I had protected our shared future. Now I was protecting clarity, structure, options. Each small step I took moved the pieces of my life into a position where change could happen smoothly, without chaos, without conflict, without the kind of emotional explosions people often imagine when relationships end. And the most interesting part was this: Daniel never sensed the shift. From his perspective, everything in our lives looked exactly the same. His meetings, his company, his plans for the future, my quiet support. The structure he believed was holding him back still appeared firmly in place. But what he didn't understand was something very simple. A structure can look stable right up until the moment it is carefully removed. The interesting thing about quiet changes is that the consequences don't arrive all at once. They appear slowly, almost gently, like subtle shifts in gravity that people feel before they understand what's causing them. In the weeks after I finished preparing everything I needed, I didn't make any dramatic announcements. There was no confrontation, no declaration, no emotional scene across the kitchen table. Instead, I began doing something much simpler. I stopped holding the entire system together. Not abruptly, not irresponsibly, just gradually. The first change was small. For years, I had managed nearly every financial detail in our household: bills, taxes, subscription renewals, and insurance deadlines. Daniel trusted me with those things because he disliked dealing with them. So when one of the minor business subscriptions attached to his company card expired, I noticed it. Normally, I would have renewed it immediately. This time, I didn't. Not out of spite, just observation. 3 days later, Daniel mentioned it casually. "Hey, do you know why the analytics dashboard stopped updating?" I looked up from my laptop. "I'm not sure," I said calmly. "Maybe the subscription expired." He frowned slightly. Huh. Then he reopened his laptop and began searching through emails. Eventually, he found the renewal notice he had ignored earlier that week. "Oh," he said. "Guess I missed that." He renewed it. Problem solved. The moment passed quickly, but it revealed something subtle. For the first time in years, Daniel had to notice one of the operational details himself. And once you begin noticing something, you start realizing how many things depend on it. The next change happened with scheduling. Daniel had always been prone to double booking meetings or forgetting small logistical details about travel. For years, I quietly corrected those mistakes before they caused problems. If 2 meetings overlapped, I sent polite rescheduling emails. If a flight confirmation looked wrong, I called the airline. If a hotel reservation needed adjusting, I handled it. Now, when those small conflicts appeared, I paused. Sometimes I mentioned them, sometimes I didn't. One afternoon, Daniel rushed into the apartment looking unusually irritated. "I swear the calendar system glitched," he said, dropping his bag on the couch. "I somehow scheduled 2 calls at the same time." I glanced at the wall calendar. "You might have," I said gently. He shook his head. "That's never happened before." I didn't respond, because it had happened before. Many times. He just hadn't been the one fixing it. Again, the moment passed quickly. Daniel rescheduled one of the calls and moved on. But the pattern was beginning to change. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Daniel began encountering the small frictions of daily logistics that had previously disappeared before reaching him. None of it was catastrophic. Nothing dramatic. Just a subtle increase in the number of things he had to handle personally. Meanwhile, something else was happening quietly in the background. Because as I stepped back from managing every operational detail, my own time began opening up in ways it hadn't for years. At first, the extra time felt strange. For more than a decade, my days had been structured around maintaining stability for 2 lives. Now, certain spaces in my schedule belonged entirely to me. Evenings became quieter. Weekends are less crowded with administrative tasks. And in those spaces, I started investing my energy somewhere new. Not into Daniel's systems, into my own. The financial courses I had been studying gradually turned into practical applications. I began consulting for a small operations-focused firm that helped early-stage startups organize their internal processes. The work was familiar territory: budget tracking, contract structure, workflow design, things I had been doing informally for years, now simply applied in a professional context. The consulting began modestly, just a few hours a week. Daniel didn't question it. When I mentioned the project, he nodded approvingly. "That's great," he said. "You're perfect for that kind of organizational work." I smiled. He meant it as encouragement. But the phrasing was interesting. That kind of organizational work. To Daniel, the skills I had developed over the years were still categorized as supportive tools. Useful, but secondary. He didn't yet see the scale of what those skills could become when applied independently. Over the next 2 months, my consulting hours increased. Quietly. Steadily. The firm I was working with introduced me to 2 additional clients who needed help stabilizing their internal operations. Suddenly, the systems I had once built for free inside our household were generating professional income. Daniel noticed the change in my schedule, but interpreted it through his existing assumptions. "Looks like you're staying busy," he said one evening while glancing at my laptop. "Just helping a few companies clean up their internal processes," I replied. He nodded. Startups always underestimate how important operations are. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me, but I didn't point it out. Because the consequences unfolding in our lives weren't about proving a point. They were about reality slowly becoming visible. And reality has a way of revealing itself without anyone needing to argue about it. Meanwhile, Daniel's own work environment was becoming slightly more complicated. Not failing, just less smooth. A payment delay here, a missed email there, a few small operational inefficiencies that previously would have been quietly corrected before they affected anything. Nothing severe enough to threaten the company, but enough to create mild frustration. One evening, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I swear the admin side of running a business gets more complicated every month," he said. I closed the notebook I had been writing in. "It can," I said. "Sometimes I wish I had someone dedicated to handling all this stuff full-time," he added. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he laughed lightly. "Well, besides you, obviously." I smiled. But this time, I didn't immediately offer to help solve the new logistical problems piling up on his desk. Not because I couldn't, simply because I had stopped volunteering for a role that no longer belonged to me. And slowly, almost invisibly, the consequences of that shift continued spreading through our shared life. Daniel wasn't panicking. Not yet. But something in the structure he relied on had begun to change. He just hadn't identified what it was. From his perspective, things were simply becoming more difficult, a little more chaotic, a little less predictable. But from where I stood, the explanation was clear. For 12 years, our life had functioned smoothly because one person was quietly managing the entire operational foundation behind the scenes. Now that the foundation was being redistributed, some of it returns to Daniel. Some of it is moving toward my own independent future. And the most fascinating part of all was this. Daniel still believed the structure that supported him was standing exactly where it had always been. He didn't yet realize that piece by piece, it had already begun moving somewhere else. The first real sign that Daniel sensed something was different didn't come from a conversation. It came from confusion. Not dramatic confusion, just the quiet kind people experience when familiar systems stop behaving the way they always have. At first, he assumed it was stress. His company was entering a complicated stage. Investor discussions were becoming more serious, and the operational side of the business demanded more attention than before. Naturally, things felt heavier. That's what he believed. But gradually, small cracks began appearing in places he didn't expect. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop with a frustrated expression. "I feel like I'm constantly putting out small fires lately," he said. "What kind of fires?" I asked calmly. "Emails I thought I answered but didn't. expenses that need organizing. Deadlines are creeping up. He rubbed his forehead. None of it is huge, but it keeps stacking up. I nodded quietly. Those were the same boring details that had quietly passed through my hands for years. But now they were visible. And visibility changes everything. A few days later, something else happened. Daniel discovered that one of the early financial agreements connected to his company required updated documentation before moving forward with a potential partnership. Normally, paperwork like that would have appeared neatly organized in the shared folders I maintained. This time, the responsibility fell directly on him. He spent nearly an entire evening digging through old documents, trying to understand the structure. I watched from the living room as he scrolled through files with growing confusion. Did we always have this many agreements attached to the early funding? He asked suddenly. Yes, I said. He paused. I guess I never realized how complicated it was. I didn't respond, because the complexity had never changed. Only his awareness had. The following week, the tension in Daniel's voice became slightly sharper, not directed at me, directed at the growing weight of things he suddenly had to manage himself. I swear running the company feels harder lately, he said one night. Sometimes growth does that, I replied. He studied me for a moment, as if trying to read something in my expression. You seem different, he said. How so? I don't know, he admitted. Calmer, maybe? I smiled slightly. I've had time to think. That answer seemed to settle his curiosity, at least for the moment. But internally, Daniel was beginning to sense something he couldn't quite define. Because when someone removes themselves from a role they've played for years, the absence doesn't appear as a single dramatic event. It appears as friction. Small inefficiencies, unexpected responsibility, a subtle shift in balance. And by the time most people recognize what has actually changed, the transition is already far too advanced to reverse. Daniel hadn't reached that realization yet, but he was getting closer. I could see it in the way he studied me sometimes, in the pauses between conversations. In the quiet moments, he seemed to be reevaluating things he had once taken for granted. But understanding takes time. And time was the one resource our relationship no longer had in abundance. Because while Daniel was still trying to understand why life suddenly felt more complicated, I had already finished preparing the next step. The conversation finally happened on a quiet Sunday morning. There was nothing dramatic about the setting. Sunlight filtered softly through the apartment windows. The city outside was unusually calm, the kind of slow morning where people move through their routines without urgency. Daniel sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, scrolling through something on his phone. I stood near the window for a moment, watching the street below. Then I walked over and sat down across from him. Daniel, I said gently. He looked up. Yeah? There's something we need to talk about. He set his phone aside immediately. His expression shifted, not alarmed, just attentive. What's going on? For a moment, I studied his face. 12 years of shared history sat quietly between us. Then I spoke. I've decided to move forward with separating. The words landed in the room with surprising stillness. Daniel blinked. Separating? He repeated. I nodded. Yes. He leaned back slightly in his chair, clearly trying to process the statement. Wait, he said slowly. Where is this coming from? There was no accusation in his voice yet, just confusion. I kept my tone calm. I've spent a long time thinking about our relationship, I said. And I realized something important. Daniel waited. You and I stopped seeing our lives the same way. Silence stretched between us. After a moment, he exhaled sharply. This is about that conversation we had a while back, isn't it? The one where you said I was holding you back? His expression tightened slightly. I didn't mean that the way it sounded. I know, I said. And I did. But intent and impact are rarely identical. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Emma, people say things when they're stressed. That doesn't mean you just walk away from 12 years. I'm not walking away from the past, I replied quietly. I'm responding to the future. He frowned. What does that mean? It means we've built a life where my role is stability, I said. And your role is ambition. That worked for a long time. Daniel leaned forward. So we adjust it. We fix it. His voice wasn't angry, just urgent. But the strange thing about clarity is that it removes the emotional pull of urgency. I shook my head gently. Daniel, I said, I already tried adjusting it. For years. He didn't respond, so I continued. You didn't notice because the system kept working. I slid a thin folder across the counter toward him. Inside were the documents outlining the legal and financial separation steps already prepared. Nothing aggressive, nothing complicated, just organized. Daniel stared at the folder for a long moment. Then he looked back at me. You've been planning this? Yes. How long? Long enough to be sure. The room fell silent again, but there was no shouting, no anger. Just two people sitting across from each other while the structure of a long relationship quietly settled into its final shape. The months after the separation were quieter than most people imagine. When relationships end, people often expect chaos, arguments, bitterness, long emotional explanations. But that wasn't what my life looked like. Instead, it felt spacious. For the first time in many years, my days belonged entirely to me. The apartment I moved into was small but bright. Morning light came through the kitchen window, and the city sounded different when I woke up without the background noise of someone else's schedule shaping the day. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar, but not lonely, just new. Work gradually became a larger part of my life, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I genuinely enjoyed it. The consulting projects I had started during the final months of my marriage continued to grow. The operational systems I helped companies build were the same kinds of systems I had once quietly maintained at home. Budget clarity, process structure, organized growth. The difference now was simple. People recognized the value of the work. Clients asked questions. They listened when I spoke. And they understood that stability wasn't the absence of ambition. It was the infrastructure that allowed ambition to succeed. Sometimes I wondered if Daniel ever realized that, not with bitterness, just curiosity. We spoke only a few times after the separation, mostly about practical matters. The conversations were calm, respectful, but different. The roles we had played for 12 years no longer existed, and without those roles, we were simply two people who had once built a life together and then chosen different paths forward. One evening, several months later, I opened the same worn leather notebook I had carried for years. The early pages were filled with household budgets and schedules. Later pages contained notes about decisions, legal meetings, and plans for independence. But the most recent pages looked different. They contained ideas, business strategies, goals that belonged entirely to me. I flipped through the notebook slowly. Then I wrote a single sentence on a fresh page. Stability was never my limitation. For years, people, including Daniel, had assumed my quiet presence meant I lacked ambition. But the truth was much simpler. I had simply been using my strength in a place where no one thought to look closely. Now that strength had a different direction. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something I was helping someone else build. It felt like something I was building for myself. Looking back now, I don't see my story as one about betrayal or revenge. It's simpler than that. For a long time, I believed being supportive meant quietly carrying the parts of life that no one else wanted to notice. I thought stability was something you gave to someone you loved so they could chase bigger dreams. But stability isn't weakness. It's structure. And structure has value, whether people recognize it or not. Daniel believed I was the reason his progress felt slow. What he didn't realize was that the same stability he saw as a limitation had been the foundation holding everything together. When I stepped away, nothing exploded. The truth simply became visible. And sometimes that's the quietest form of clarity a person can experience. So if there's one thing I learned from those 12 years, it's this. Never assume the quietest person in the room is the least powerful one. Sometimes they're simply the one who understands the system best. I'm curious about your thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation where someone mistook your strength for weakness?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.